Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode on the Cerebral Cricketer podcast. Today we have a very, very special guest on the show. Daniel Cherny is a Melbourne-based sports journalist and cricket writer with Code Sports. He has covered domestic and international cricket extensively, and his work has also appeared in Wisden, including contributions to the Wisden Almanac. So thank you, Daniel, for coming on the show.
Pleasure, Tansen. Nice to be with you.
I know you've interacted with many sports stars, not just in cricket. Your work is across all different kinds of sports. So I'm just curious, what made you get into sports writing in general?
Look, I always had a passion for sport. Was not particularly good at it. I still enjoy playing a little bit now. Still play a little bit of cricket every now and again when family and work commitments allow. But look, I always had an interest, as I said. Enjoy writing. Had an interest in media from a young age, and I didn't necessarily think that it was possible for this to be a career path. But I sort of struggled my way through a law degree at university, which I didn't really enjoy, and sort of one thing led to another. As I said, I always had this passion probably deep inside me, and started to sort of pursue it a bit on the side, and one thing led to another, and I was lucky enough to get a bit of a foot in the door, sort of more than a decade ago, and at the Age newspaper, and then was there for 8 years, and then moved to Code Sports when it launched a bit over 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago. So, I think, as I said, ultimately a passion for sport, an interest in media, probably some degree of aptitude for the language and the like, and the combination of all those things. I've been very lucky to be able to do this for a living.
Any particular cricket club you've been associated from a young age?
I played quite a bit of junior cricket at Maccabi Ajax Cricket Club in Melbourne, and then later I've been at Elstonwick Cricket Club, playing some senior cricket there the last few years. Always good fun. As I said, not a particularly good cricketer, but by any stretch, but ultimately enjoy doing so. And it's about the it's about the experiences you have with teammates and the people you meet, and just the time outside, and the camaraderie and the culture. That's what you get out of it more than the performance itself, I suppose, at that level.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of, you mentioned when you got your foot in the door within journalism at the age, I think, hopefully I heard that correctly. And so, like, what did you start off with? Because I know that I mentioned earlier, like, you covered a lot of different sports. So from there, you progress sort of now. I think you're more specializing within cricket, but you're still covering other sports as well. So how did that journey start out for you in journalism?
Yeah. So I think as I touched on when I was finished school in 2008, and I did end up finishing the university degree to fast forward, but I probably had an interest in this area and never really didn't necessarily think that it was feasible to do it as a career. But a bunch of mates and I started a website called Backpage. It's a big one called Footy Couch, where we did a bit of a light-hearted footy AFL commentary stream. I actually got the idea from guys in the UK called Test Match Sofa, including of whom included Daniel Norcross, who's now at the BBC, has been for a long time as one of their commentators, and Jared Kimber, who you probably heard of, who's done a lot of broadcasting and writing and YouTubing now. He does some incredible work. Lucky enough to know both those guys a bit. So, they two. Anyway, that sort of idea spawned Footy Couch, and one thing led to another, and I started doing some writing for a website called Backpage Lead. The two major sporting interests in terms of sports themselves were Aussie rules, as in the AFL, and cricket. They still remain to this day to be my two sort of favourite sports. Always grew up on them both. Probably somewhat conventional from a Melbourne sporting landscape to sort of have the footy in the winter and cricket in the summer. Not to say that I'm not interested in a lot of other sports, and have followed plenty of others and continue to do so to relative degrees. But anyway, was very like after a while within this degree, I sort of started push forward and apply for some jobs. I was very lucky. I got this through this Backpage Lead website. I was offered a 12-month contract at the age. I was sort of recommended for that job, and then fortunately enough was offered it. So that was my major foot in the door. And I was there at the age for almost 8 years. Amazing place. Still got a lot of friends there. Was very lucky to work at a place like that. It was a place with incredible history. Mainly covering. Look, I think in particular in Melbourne, footy is sort of as the primary sport, and so a lot of the time is spent covering footy. But I always had an interest in cricket, so tried to do as much cricket as I could as well. But I did a lot of different sports at the age. In particular, lucky enough to cover a few Australian Open tennis tournaments. Did a bit of soccer. I even covered a Melbourne Cup. A little bit of golf, and lucky enough to do be part of our team in the Rio Olympics in 2016, where I sort of dabbled in a range of sports, many of which I doubt I'll ever cover again, like fencing or water polo. Not necessarily sports that you typically cover as part of a Melbourne sports writers beat, but I suppose that's the nature of the Olympics. That was an amazing experience. I did a couple of Test cricket tours when I was at the age. One for Australian Test tours, covered one in Bangladesh in 2017. And then in 2018, I went to the UAE when Australia played Pakistan, and covered several home tests as well. A lot of domestic cricket, a lot of Big Bash cricket, particularly around the Victorian teams, the Stars and the Renegades, and then the Victorian men's team. Also quite a bit of WBBL cricket too. Some Aussie women's stuff. And then, since I've been at Code, wasn't necessarily the plan that I would exclusively do cricket once I moved, but just sort of evolved a bit that way, just due to various staffing reasons and just the way things panned out. But I ended up, I've been sort of the group's primary cricket writer, Code Sports across the News Corp mastheads for a few years now. Been very, very lucky to do cover a lot of cricket, a lot of incredible experiences, a lot of touring in recent years. Was at the Ashes in 2023, the World Cup, 50 over World Cup at the end of 2023, Men's World Cup. That is Test tours of New Zealand, Sri Lanka, and the West Indies as well. Plenty of home summers in there too. So, we've been very, very lucky to have a range of interesting experiences, and hopefully more to come.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Like journalism and the opportunities it's given you in sport and traveling and touring and having those experiences as well. It seems amazing. And I mean, I'll try to bundle two questions in one because you mentioned Jared Kimber and he's Victorian originally. Yourself, obviously based in Victoria. So, is there a culture have you noticed? Maybe I'm reading too much into it, where there are some interesting cricket personalities that more so originate from Victoria as opposed to maybe New South Wales? Or is there also a difference in journalism culture in Victoria versus New South Wales? And also on top of that, when it comes to covering cricket, what are the big differences have you found compared to covering other sport as well within journalism?
Interesting. I'll start with Jared. I mean, I read Jared. You may not know this. I probably have told him, but and no, he's not a super duper close friend of mine. But I really still enjoy a lot of his work. But I remember reading when he was blogging. I was a big domestic cricket fan. I'd be one of the few people that would turn up to Sheffield Shield games and with a couple of my mates, sort of, in our teens and mid to late teens, maybe early 20s. But I remember going even as a kid as well. And he had this blog called The Lone Bushrangers Fan, when Victoria were known as the Bushrangers, and he would blog and he'd be quite colourful in his writing, and just like he is now, but obviously a great cricket brain too. Look, in terms of I think, Melbourne has sort of self-proclaimed sporting capital of Australia, and I think that is largely true. Not to say that Sydney, for instance, and several other the capital cities don't have strong sporting cultures too. But I suppose Melbourne, with its gamut of, as the sort of the starting point being the AFL, having the 10 clubs and the bumper crowds they get over a long period of time. Combine that with clearly the cricket and the Boxing Day Test and all the and when I was growing up, it was a lot of one day internationals and the big crowds they would draw to those, and then combined with various other sports, the major events, Australian Open, the Grand Prix. It was an Olympic city back in the day. Big golf events over the years. It's drawn world championships in other sports, cycling, gymnastics. I think there's a very strong sporting culture in Melbourne. Probably, I think, not that Melbourne doesn't have a lot of other things going on culturally, but I think sport is just such a central part of the Melbourne psyche. And in terms of journalism, I don't necessarily think there's this huge cultural difference per se. I think the footy culture here is pervasive and dominant. And if you not to say that the rugby league culture isn't dominant in Sydney or Brisbane, but if you pick up if you read news bulletins or pick up papers, or go on leading news websites, certainly during the footy season, but even outside of footy season, it is often dominated by the AFL. But then, by the same token, when there's the other events are on, and say an Ashes Summer or the Boxing Day Test, cricket gets enormous coverage too. I think there's probably the major differences culturally between the two states. I don't think it's really enormous, but probably Sydney. Sydney, I think, is a little bit of a maybe broader church. I say this is someone who's never lived in Sydney, but it does have not more going on necessarily, but it's got more pockets and more sort of disparate areas. Whereas Melbourne, yes, there are pockets, but I think there is sort of an element to Melbourne which is people do congregate upon the same place. They go to the MCG as a matter of ritual during the footy season and the cricket season, perhaps in a way that say in Sydney isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, definitely. No, it sounds like, and in terms of when it comes to covering cricket versus other sports,
Yes.
what differences have you found when it comes to like going to the Sheffield Shield games potentially, or Australia games, and versus maybe other sports? Because I would assume, because cricket, if you go to Test cricket, obviously it's a lot more longer than maybe other sports, and that plays into how you maybe cover it. Like, what experiences have you felt in particular when doing cricket versus other sports?
Yes, sorry, I knew there was a part of the question I hadn't answered. I think. Look, I think the way cricket is covered in Australia, cricket is an enormous sport in Australia. Clearly, it is one of the big three tier one sports, which is sort of widely accepted with Aussie rules and rugby league, the AFL and NRL in shorthand. I think cricket here, it is more seasonal though, as opposed to say in India, other parts of the subcontinent where it's your cricket is massive 12 months of the year, and is just a dominant force and it stands on its own. Here it is very seasonal. So around the height of the Test summer, or maybe during the Big Bash League, or say Australia there's an Ashes tour or a big Test tour of India or South Africa, or the end of a 50 over World Cup, where it does tend to hog attention. But for a lot of the year, it does operate to a degree in the background, and even say, speak to you a week after the Sheffield Shield final in Melbourne, and including crowds at Shield games never been enormous, but even so, like, it doesn't, actually got good press in Adelaide when they won, but it doesn't necessarily cut through because it's compete in Melbourne when it's competing with the early stages of an AFL season, and potentially some other major events. And I do think there's been a bit of a creep with particularly the American sports, and they're sort of taking over, gaining greater prominence. I mean, even the fact that the NFL game is being played at the MCG in September, I think, plays a role in terms of the way it's actually covered, from a journalist perspective. I mean, yeah, clearly you're right. A day of Test cricket is a longer day, and then if the matches go the distance and you're going 5 days, and particularly the and then when you're getting preview days. I was thinking about this the other day when I got back from the end of the Shield final. I sort of thought, I'm quite tired here because I probably wasn't conditioned to matches going 5 days after some of the recent tests we've had. But um, they can be quite long days, particularly in a test match where the coverage is rolling, and in a digital world, you're not just writing from a print perspective. You're sort of filing for online and trying to keep across things regularly. And at the height of the summer, it's very relentless and consistent sort of work, which is fine and part of the territory. And the reason that such a job exists is because there is that appetite, and I'm very lucky to be able to do that. I think, compared, I am using, and probably will continue to use, the AFL here as a key reference point. I think when you compare it to, say, the AFL or I suppose the other, or the NRL, clearly they have teams of 18 and 17 leagues of 18 and 17 teams respectively in the men's competitions, plus the women's competitions. And then rugby league, you've got things like Origin and international football as well. The AFL's got does have State of Origin now as well, and it's got some other auxiliary sort of parts to it. But I think there is sort of a very broad level of interest in the footy codes. If you write about the 15th player on the 14th ranked team, there's still some degree of interest, whereas in cricket, it is still very top heavy. I think particularly in Australia, there's much of the attention ultimately still hovers around the Australian men's international team, particularly the Test team, particularly during big series. So it's a very concentrated level of interest. That's not to say there isn't interest in other nations, particularly when they're playing Australia, there's no interest in domestic cricket or franchise cricket or women's cricket, but it is still very, as I said, quite top heavy, and that's probably the biggest difference, I think, between covering, and the two sports that I've covered in depth, say covering the AFL and cricket, is that in the AFL you do have a wide array of clubs, players that attract significant interest, whereas in Australia it is still it is very quite a small group of players, and really it's one team, to be frank, that generates the lion's share of attention.
Regarding Sheffield Shield, what do you think of, because everyone's talking about the advent of T20 cricket, how it's progressing, and IPL and big money and privatization of Big Bash, all that kind of conversation. So when we talk about that, we're already assuming that T20 cricket accelerating, and then by default it implies that Test cricket is dying. But I'd say in the recent past, whenever I go to Sheffield Shield games, because I'm based in Victoria, if I go MCG or I go Junction, I actually work close to Junction Oval, so that really helps me. I sometimes pop in for a bit if there's a game happening, and I've definitely noticed a lot more people going to watch games as opposed to maybe 3-4 years ago. Maybe I'll correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong in my observation. I just happen to go whenever there's people, but there definitely seems to be more eyeballs in Sheffield Shield, I feel, than maybe 5-6 years ago. So what's your take on that? Because even when Australia India a test series happened, this was the year before, there were crowds even for day 5 at the MCG for the Boxing Day, and that kind of shows that there is a lot of fans who want to watch test cricket and are interested in long format cricket. So what's your sort of take on that?
I think there's probably a significant distinction needs to be made between crowds for the Sheffield Shield and for Test cricket. I mean, I think, look, notwithstanding that, I think Cricket Victoria has done a very good job. This is a very sort of a micro level, but have done a very good job in terms of promoting the Shield to sort of quite a rusted on base. And I think Shield's a funny thing because this is, I mean, when I say never drawn crowds, I mean maybe decades, 50 plus, 60 years ago, there were days when it might have drawn 20, 30,000 for big events. Victoria, New South Wales played on Boxing Day, predating the Boxing Day test. But that realistically, there would have, and I know in Adelaide last year, when they broke that when they broke that drought, they had big crowds at Karen Rolton Oval, or a small ground but packed out. They got a few thousand to days 3 and 4, respectively, of the Shield final at Junction Oval this year. But realistically, the Shield is not a spectator event. It's not designed for. It's not scheduled for people to attend. It's scheduled, on weekdays, and if it goes into the weekend, that's sort of incidental. It's not designed to be a spectator event. If they get a few hundred, a couple of thousand people maximum there, that's a nice sort of bonus. But there is sort of still quite a large degree of people who follow the Shield. A, because there's just general interest, and B, because of the national team implications. So the Shield the Shield from a journalist perspective is far and away at its most newsworthy in the lead up to big test series. So generally at the start of the summer, and the last couple of years have been prime examples when there have been so-called bat-offs for positions, in the team. So opening vacancies has been a big thing in Australian Test cricket for a long time now. So, there's a bat-off or a bowl-off because there's a couple of quicks that have gone down. People are interested in who may take those spots and the respective performances of those players. But the actual day-to-day people riding the bumps of the performances of their states, there's a bit of that, but it's pretty negligible. Test cricket, though, is another matter altogether. And, Test cricket is still enormous in Australia, particularly when it's against England and India or around the marquee slots. I think Australia and England are, to varying degrees, outliers compared to the global trends. Australia is an interesting one. T20 cricket. It's not to say T20 cricket hasn't caught on, because clearly it has. And you see the crowds and the ratings at the Big Bash League. But I think they're culturally, for whatever reason, there's still a conservatism that prevails in Australian cricket, and Test cricket is still seen as the real stuff, the serious stuff. To a lesser degree, you then have 50-over cricket, really only when we're talking World Cups now. I mean, bilateral 50-over cricket has sort of faded to be a very peripheral thing in Australia. And the crowds that tend to come to bilateral cricket in Australia tend to be almost exclusively because of the away team's fans. And that's almost always subcontinental. So Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan have their fan bases, for whatever reason, seem to still be hyper engaged with bilateral 50 over and T20 cricket, whereas that's just not really the case to a large degree with sort of rank and file Australian fans. But Test cricket is. And so, look, the 75,000 on day 5 of Boxing Day was extraordinary. I mean, it was a perfect storm. The tickets were quite cheap. The match was still very much alive. The stakes were very high. The series was 1-1. It had been an engrossing Test match to that point, a Test series. You had the Constance effect as well, which sort of took it to another level across the community. But then, a hyper engaged Indian community too. The fact that the Boxing Day Test is it's not prohibitive from a price point, but I wouldn't say it's an elite corporate event, but there is a reasonable degree of corporate and MCC and big end of town, top end of town sort of attention to it and patronage. So the fact that you get that day 5 was open. I can't remember the exact circumstances. I don't think the MCC was open to everyone, but there may have been there may have been loosened to a degree. Whatever it was clearly much more affordable and a different sort of crowd than you would generally get to an MCG day, Test match day. But look, we see the crowds and the TV ratings across the country, and even on days that are not necessarily, particularly for India and England. And even on work days and what were that aren't necessarily in the Christmas New Year period, but particularly around that Christmas New Year period and the sort of the marquee test, and then you add the day-night test factor and the Perth being streamed back live into the prime time into the eastern seaboard. Enormous ratings and interest for test matches, as I said, particularly with the Ashes and the BGT. So that is where the height of interest is in Australia still. an interesting discussion point because it comes against this backdrop of the prospect of privatisation of the Big Bash League and this discussion of as to whether they should move the Sydney Test to sort of make extra space for the Big Bash League. And I can see the argument for it, but you're sort of so culturally entrenched now, even though they're not necessarily generations old. Some of these matches, the Boxing Day Test has only been in its current slot sort of consistently for 40, 50 years. The Sydney Test, not even 30. But, they are now quite very entrenched in their respective slots. And therefore, to move either of them, you're flirting with form. You are shifting commercially winning entities, and you're not sure what whether you'll gain more or whether the cost of shifting, say, the Sydney Test will be worth the potential upside in the Big Bash League. So these are the types of discussions that senior Australian cricket administrators are having and will continue to have.
When it comes to Sheffield Shield specifically, and we compare that to international cricket, do you feel that right now, as it is, because in the past, when we talked about Sheffield Shield, I'm talking like decades ago, the likes of, you have the likes of Brad Hodge, for example, who's playing his trade in Sheffield Shield, and we know that because he's doing well and racking up runs, he'll definitely do well in international cricket. He just didn't get that opportunity per se. But whereas now we may not have that same faith where we're not even getting players that are averaging 50, but I mean, that's a separate conversation in terms of why that is the case. But in the just specifically, I guess, talking about Sheffield Shield in of itself being a breeding ground for international test cricket, do you think it's still a good enough high quality competition that ensures that whoever is the best performer in Sheffield Shield, like the best batsman, they're pretty much guaranteed, I wouldn't say guaranteed, but are more likely to do well in international because of, I guess, the challenges and the rigors of Sheffield Shield is transferable to international test cricket?
I think it's still pretty good. The biggest challenge the Sheffield Shield faces on that front, there's a couple, and you touched on the pitches, also the scores, the averages, which is pitch and ball related, I think primarily. Increased grass on pitches and the new Kookaburra ball, which is not that new anymore, 5 or 6 years old, but the double reinforced Kookaburra with the extra reinforced seam and the extra layer of lacquer, which is getting quite technical, but I think is widely attributed as being one of the key reasons why the scores are down. And then there's probably some technical elements too and temperament, which are harder to quantify, but maybe associated with the T20 era. Leaving that to one side, I think the fact that you've got the fact that the calendar has been crunched and that you're not necessarily getting it's the top, the test caliber player or even the next tier of player routinely playing the Sheffield Shield. That's the challenge. Cricket Australia, I think, is conscious of this. Look, having been at the Sheffield Shield final, the fact that you had Alex Carey and Scott Boland playing, I think that is an extra, that generates an enormous test for whoever they're playing against. And facing Scott Boland on a grassy wicket Junction Oval, you're not going to get too much tougher a challenge at Test cricket than that. So if you can withstand that, or conversely, against an Alex Carey at the peak of his powers with the bat and the gloves for that matter, for a bowler coming through trying to figure out how to counter and stifle him, that's a challenge too. It's not a guarantee to know that the player will go on and succeed at Test cricket, but I think if you look at recent history, you look at Bo Webster having starred in Shield cricket for a few years, as well as in county cricket, and done well for Australia A too. But for that matter, he, in his Test appearances to date, has performed very well. I think Michael Neser, over a long period of time, outstanding Shield performer, has done well in Test cricket, so that's reassuring. Scott Boland got picked on the back of sensational Shield performances and has gone to another level altogether in Test cricket. So, that's a very assuring sign for the sort of integrity and the strength of the Shield as a test match breeding ground. But it's not foolproof, and probably there have been others that haven't gone as well. Maybe some of the others have been picked ahead of without the sheer weight of runs or wickets that those three no touched on had. Cameron Green's an interesting case. I mean, people talk about Cameron Green and should he be in the team, and should they? And then there's people say, well, pick the reward Shield form. Well, Cameron Green's Sheffield Shield numbers are extraordinary, particularly with a bat. It performs outstandingly well, but has thus far been unable to consistently produce that at test level. And then if you look at the recent examples of Jake Weatherall's, middling start to his test career, it looks like they are going to persist with him, but, the jury's very much out. Sam Constance is still extremely young, but, couldn't get it done at test level for an extended period. Nathan McSweeney had a real baptism of fire, and couldn't get it done. Again, these guys weren't necessarily averaging the Hodge, Jamie Siddons, Martin Love type of numbers of a generation or two ago. And even someone like Brendan Doggett's an interesting case study. Very, very good Shield numbers before getting picked. Ended up playing a role, not the one he really played at Shield level in the Test side, because they had other guys who would play that role. And end up being a sort of a bit of a blunt weapon and being used as a bouncer merchant, and did okay. Be interested to see how he goes if he gets another crack at it. Playing the sort of the new ball role that he's done better for South Australia. So it's a mixed bag. I think the Shield is still very strong overall, and I was heartened to see what we saw at the back end of the season. But by the same token, when you have the same time as the Shield final, you had Travis Head playing in the IPL, you had Matt Short playing in the IPL, you have several other players from other states who've gone off. And you do wonder, it was good to see that, say, Sam Harper stayed back for the Shield final before going to the PSL. I doubt he would have got permission to go, and Marnus Labuschagne would have stayed had Queensland made the Shield final. So, the Shield still seems to have primacy over the PSL, but it definitely doesn't over the IPL. And, I think that the horse is bolted in that regard. And say someone like Steve Smith, who I can understand why he doesn't want to play that much Shield cricket anymore. But, I think there is a degree of watering down the culture of guys playing Shield cricket if you do make allowances for a legend like Steve Smith in the latter part of his career, and what that potentially does for others who may feel, okay, well, if Steve doesn't have to play Shield cricket, well, why should I have to play Shield cricket? So that is a bit of a cautionary tale, I think, for Australian cricket. And that's not a slight on Steve Smith, because, as I said, I think at this stage of his career, I can completely understand why he would not want to be fronting for New South Wales 6 times a year. But they've just got to be careful that they don't overdo it in that respect.
I also wanted to ask, Andy, because I've had a few journalists, but in terms of specifically you're covering Australian cricket journalism, so I guess it's a unique standpoint because you get to see and witness as a third person what players are going through. Like, I guess when it comes to we talked about, for example, Sam Consis, many players that may have that are young, but then, for example, they would have played grade cricket and then Sheffield Shield and then international cricket. There's that kind of transition, right? And it seems like from Sheffield Shield, we're talking about maybe the crowd isn't as big, and then obviously in international cricket you have like packed stadiums. There seems to be a huge jump, right? And within that, there's, from a media perspective, there's so much to take in, right? Like there's social media, people talking about you, and there's press conferences, all this sort of stuff. So how have you felt when it comes to players handling that? Or maybe you've seen a young player go through that? Because I think Sam kind of mentioned in passing wherever he talked about in the media when it comes to that transition. But from your angle, because I can imagine it's a huge step up, firstly, just in terms of the level of cricket alone, but then all this other stuff you have to handle before the game and after the game that's like unlike someone has ever dealt with, right? And then when they're at home, probably before they go to bed, they're on social media and people are talking about them. It must be like crazy to be in that world, right, of international cricket. So have you found players, seem to adjust easily, or do you think that's a big reason maybe as to why some players might even struggle at the highest level? It's not even about the cricket; it's about all this other external stuff that they have to handle. So I just wanted to get those perspectives from your point of view as well as a cricket journalist.
Look, I think Sam is an extreme example in the sense that he obviously debuted so young, what was it, 19, um, and had barely played a year of first class cricket. One thing these days, because of the Big Bash and the advent of T20 cricket, is that most of these guys are playing, even though it's not going to be 90,000 on Boxing Day, they are playing in relatively filled stadiums in prime time with plenty of cameras and mics and the like, and a degree of media coverage, and a pretty high degree of media coverage from a young age. Most of these guys, like even Nathan McSweeney, for instance, who would not have been a household name by any stretch before he played, but yeah, he played a bit for Australia A, and that experience I don't think is anything like playing for Australia, because those matches are not in front of many people at all. But if you play for Brisbane Heat for a few years and you won the Big Bash with them before, he was playing in front of packed crowds. And even Sam Constas, though it may not have been that many games. Like I remember, I think even a week before he got picked for Australia, a few days he made some runs at Manuka Oval. That would have been a reasonable crowd. We're talking five figures, so we're not talking tiny. The next, but I think Sam has spoken that he did go off social media for a bit at a certain stage post. I mean, that is such an extreme situation where this perfect storm of a teenager being blooded into the biggest Test match of the year, playing these audacious shots that no one that people couldn't comprehend against this all-time great bowler, having a degree of success. There's a couple of on-field clashes. There's his sort of general charisma, his charm, that just he becomes this icon, almost unwittingly, and overnight, when the space, not even overnight, in the space of a couple of hours on Boxing Day morning. Look, I think probably like most things, the older I think guys are, the better they tend to handle it, albeit, and if they've gone through if they know their game to a degree. But I've known older players who I think of, even guys who come into Test cricket at an older level, who have sort of probably had a degree of stage fright, and who have probably maybe put too much pressure on themselves. And maybe the counter argument is that if you're young and impetuous to a degree, or immune to the immune to the potential consequences of failure, that can perhaps be emboldening, and that may have helped someone like a Constas, albeit, as I said, he hasn't done it over a sustained period. I mean, there are a handful of examples of guys who have, clearly at various points felt the strain of media attention. I mean, the recent one with Cameron Green, and his interaction with Tom Decent at the Sydney Morning Herald, which was well documented. And that was certainly from my dealings with Cameron Green, uncharacteristic of him. I think can be emblematic of someone seemingly feeling, at the risk of putting words into his mouth, feeling the strain of a lot of public scrutiny. And he is also an extreme example because of sort of being anointed, and this sort of extraordinary level of expectation that's placed upon a young all-rounder and this generational player. And then adding the IPL price tag, and this sort of this level of almost nothing is going to be good enough. And not that he had performed well in the lead up to that point. He had gone through a very rough trot and had, in my view, very much fairly deserved scrutiny. But I think that was it. That was an interesting case study in terms of how it can come a cropper, and when these guys can feel the strain. So yeah, look, it's not. There's no one size fits all. There's a range of different reactions to these sort of environments and stimuli. Um, some guys handle it better. Some guys probably handle it better the second or third time, and they need to experience it a bit, go back. Um, I don't think I'm speaking out of school here. Like someone like say Peter Hanscom, I think, for instance, came into the test side relatively young, in mid 20s, not stupidly young, but and started well, and then suddenly there's this incredible level of scrutiny on his technique in the middle of an Ashes series, and he gets dropped, and it almost just becomes this sort of prevailing truth that he has these technical flaws and he's too far back in his crease and he can't handle high pace bowling, and that's almost become his narrative for better or for worse. And I think he battled with that, and I think there was a degree of resentment or frustration from his level around that narrative, and probably still is to a level. But I think he's a much more zen character than he was, say, 10 years ago. And I think if he got another chance, I'm not saying he will, but he'd be an interesting case studies. I think if he got another chance, I think he'd be better placed because I think he's in a better spot mentally. And I think he that, and not say he's in a bad spot mentally there, but I just think there's some wisdom that he would have picked up from an extra decade of professional cricket experience. So he's an example of someone I would give that where the longer you're in the game, that you probably get more out of it.
Do you think there's a culture within the Australian cricket context when it comes to having narratives of certain players? Because, like you just touched on, Peter Hanscom, I think he's a really good example because people talk about how he's only a spin specialist. And then he's suddenly in the conversation, like I think it was last year or the year before, when it comes to the Sri Lanka tour. And but then he's not considered in other places around the world in the same way he is for Sri Lanka, even though he's done well in England and in Sheffield Shield specifically for a long, long time. He's probably one of the most consistent domestic performers for some time, and so that's kind of a narrative that I don't know if it's actually. I mean, I suspect obviously like the selectors aren't just kind of applying a public narrative onto a player and then making decisions accordingly, but it may, I guess, I don't know, implicitly or subconsciously influence selections because, like, for example, another example would be like Manus when it comes to him being lucky. And, there was all those stats going around in social media about, how many drop catches, he's had off his batting and all that kind of stats. And then Jared, funny enough, Jared Kimber had a good episode on this. I actually listened to on his channel where he kind of broke down how nuanced that conversation is because what constitutes a dropped catch or a missed chance in data analysis can vary from platform to platform. So I thought that was really insightful in that sense. So it can be a bit unlucky. Like you just need to maybe assess it a bit more rather than just kind of take it at face value when it comes to, I guess, the nature of social media, right? Like you just see a stat, you see a short clip, and then it just sort of convinces you of something, and then you sort of think that and that can happen for many other players, right? Like for example, I think even before I would say the Australian home series, I know Cameron Green hasn't done as well as people would like on home shores, but he had a pretty decent West Indies tour if you think about the context of that. And then he had that really good performance in New Zealand. I think he scored 100 plus odd in a really a number four. And so there seems to be a narrative of certain players, I'd like to say, and I don't, for whatever reason, how that happens. It can vary. But do you think players themselves battle with it, and then on extending off that, do you think that may shape selections? It could not. It doesn't necessarily have to be in maybe international cricket or Australian selectors. It can be even just like for Sheffield Shield. Like people talk about Sam Conser sometimes, like, oh, he's just one trick pony, just does laps shots or whatever. But that's not necessarily the case if people watched him properly. But then sometimes that impression is given and may affect him in a certain way. So yeah, just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Oh, look, I think like in life, I think we use cognitive shortcuts, don't we? And first impressions can be hard to change. They stick. They often stick, and these sort of stereotypes or your labels are just they could just be for whatever reason. Sometimes they latch on to people and they get latched onto people, and then as I said, very hard to budge. I think the examples you use there are all pretty fair. I mean, you spot on. I think with that Marnus being lucky video that Jared did was an excellent piece of work. Um, Hanscom's a spin specialist. Definitely a narrative. Cameron Green's tour of, I think Cameron Green is an interesting one. I think that part of that is that he's suffered from the fact that his best performances have come overseas. And I sort of go back to the fact that Australian cricket and the way it's followed is quite narrow. And, there is a large swathe of people that if it didn't happen between mid-November and the end of the first week of January, it didn't happen at all to them, or maybe if it didn't happen in Ashes series, they are very, very narrow-minded in the way they follow cricket, which is not a crime, but it hurts a player like Cam Green if you're getting it done with some important 40s and 50s in the middle of the night during a tour of the West Indies, which is low scoring and out of sight and out of mind. I think these things definitely are factors. How much of a factor that would be in, do the selectors, because Peter Hanscom is described as a subcontinental specialist, spin specialist by the media, does that influence whether selectors don't pick him for tests in Australia? I don't think so. And sometimes there is actually some truth here. I mean, it's, the selectors do have a view about the way he plays pace and do worry about how he would go against extreme pace, and do think he's a better player against spin. I suppose that's the balance of selection, trying to discern the art of selection, trying to discern what's real and what's just noise. I think over a long period of time, this Australian selection panel, I think, is one that has been pretty. Look, I think they do a lot of data analysis, so they're not one, or they certainly lean on heavily on analysis. When they dropped Nathan Lyon in Jamaica, they explicitly said that they would lean on the analysis and the data around some of the pink ball stats, particularly the pink Duke's ball, to leave him out in favour of Scott Boland and the 4 quicks there. So, certainly, like any, I think public figures, but particularly in cricket, can be beholden to these narratives. He's no good against. Michael Bevan was the old one. Like, why didn't Michael Bevan make runs as a test player? There was just this narrative that you just couldn't handle a short ball, and there was probably a degree of truth to it. I think, like most narratives, like this, there's usually a degree of truth, but it becomes the truth, and that's where nuance, I think, becomes lacking. And in a time poor environment, people don't have the time to be drifting in and out and doing the deep dives. It's like, well, if that's the headline or that's the cognitive shortcut that we make, well, that's our belief. We just run with it. So I think media does have responsibility to sort of not be not being too lazy on that front. And it's one thing I'm not saying I always do it. I'm not saying I've never been guilty of it, but it's one thing I'd like to try to, if you to try to, well, obviously try to be fair and balanced, and then and as an extension, having nuance in your commentary around and analysis around these things, that hopefully, helps shape narratives, but or maybe breaks down some rigid beliefs or some stereotypes. But sometimes they can actually back them up, and sometimes it's just the truth. And I'm not to say that any of the specific instances are backed up, but sometimes these are just the facts.
When it comes to Shield players or even international players, we see it's a tough sport. You consistently see players getting dropped or out of teams, and not get selected. How have you observed from your end or from your perspective players dealing with non-selection and uncertainty? How do they manage it and deal with it? Do they spiral? Do they some push back harder? Do you think some of them take it as if it's an injustice, or some people just take it on the chin and move on? What have you observed from your end? So it'd be good to kind of get that insight in terms of a player's mindset from your end.
I mean, look, there's a spectrum, and I mean, ultimately, as much as we as reporters can try to understand what's going on, and just from the way people behave or what they say, or what we hear of the way they've been behaving around others, ultimately we can't know exactly what's going on in their head. I mean, we're only speculating or trying to understand what or listening, and hopefully most of the time the players are honest, but there's sometimes there's incentives for them to not be fully honest. I mean, the example of Nathan Lyon in his Channel 7 interview, very raw Channel 7 interview where he goes, it was absolutely filthy. That was, I thought, quite refreshing, and a guy who was not trying to gild the lily. I don't think he was being denigrating to the selection panel, but he acknowledged that he took it as a sort of a personal, took it very personally, and very, he was genuinely hurt by his omission from a home test. It's been such a rarity. And this is a guy who, being part of the Australian test team, is such an enormous part of his identity, that he, that took him time to get over. He may still not be over it. He hasn't spoken much in recent times. Other guys are more, like I've seen guys react different ways. Some get bitter. Some feel like there has been injustice. Some cop it on the chin. I think some in hindsight. I think Marnus, in hindsight, probably accepts he had to be dropped in the West Indies, head of the West Indies tour, and that was actually for the best. Albeit, the jury's out as to whether that will spark a long-term revival for him, but he probably accepted it at the time. Others sometimes feel they've been genuinely stitched up. There have been, I've seen a run of guys who, some guys, when they're not selected or get dropped, they're asked and they say they don't agree with it. Others say others are more diplomatic. I think hopefully, in the long run, most of these the good thing about selectors is they tend to not be, I'm sure, look, we all have our biases, but I think in relatively recent times, I think these selectors have not necessarily held it against players if they have spoken their mind about their non-selections. I think Marcus Harris, for instance, I probably have a Victorian bias here just because being based in Melbourne, I know Victorian players generally better than I know some from the other states. But someone like a Marcus Harris, I think, when he was dropped when he was not picked for the Australian team in late 24, when they went with Nathan McSweeney in that opener, and it seemed to be out of the two of them, I think he issued some home truths in his view to the way he'd been treated to Andy McDonald, and they had a long-standing relationship, so they were sort of okay with that, and they sort of, he spoke his mind, but they moved on. I remember John Holland, I did an interview with him when he got left out for the Sydney Test in 2018 when they went for Ash Nagar as the second spinner in the squad. He was pretty cut up about it, or at the very least was pretty blunt about non-selection. But then a few weeks later, they picked him for a tour of South Africa. That was a different selection panel. So, there are examples. Hanscom's another one. I think Hanscom interviewed him when just after he missed out on that Sri Lanka tour that you touched on earlier, and I think he was pretty disappointed. And he'd sort of, without willing to put words into his mouth, I think there was an element where he probably felt strung along because he'd been taken to Sydney and it seemed to be looking in his direction. Whereas earlier this year, I spoke to Todd Murphy after he'd missed out in Melbourne and Sydney, and he was much more philosophical and was much more glass half full about it all. I'm sort of happy to be thereabouts. And the fact that he was sort of in the conversation, and even though he hadn't been picked for the 11, I think it was a sense that he was quite, if not content, then comfortable enough with the general trajectory of his career. So different guys respond to it in different ways. Probably like, ultimately, as much as they're all cricketers, they're all people, and they all have different ways of reacting to these sorts of things, and rationalising. And there's the short term, and then there's the longer term. In the long run, a lot of these guys probably do accept the reasons for their selection, for the non-selections, when they may have struggled in the first instance to fully appreciate it. But I think now they tend to generally get it in the long run, and sometimes probably in hindsight they say, oh, actually, now that give it a week or a month or a few years, they say, actually, the selectors were probably right. So that does happen. And there is, I think, sometimes with guys being dropped, there's a bit of a release of tension, and it's like, okay, now I can breathe. I'm sort of, there's so much pressure when you're in the side, and it's actually, and people are constantly at you. And Marnus had this for a long period of time because his numbers were so high. There was this sort of dwindling of form over an extended period, so that by the time he was finally dropped, it was sort of, I think, to a degree, actually a sigh of relief, and he could then move on and rechannel his energies into getting better as a cricketer rather than just surviving.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. And I wanted to ask you in terms of social media specifically. I think over the past decade or past 5 years, it's definitely changed, and the way that players use it has definitely changed. And what has been your observation when it comes to cricketers on social media? Do you think that they use it for self-image? They could be trying to promote themselves, market themselves in that way, or is it just a way to stay in touch with the fans and occasional posts here or there? And also in terms of criticism, like how have you seen cricketers handle criticism that they read online or otherwise? So I guess the question is more so around how players use social media and for what ends, and also how do players deal with that criticism? Do they try to shut it off? I know some players don't even have. I think Zach Crawley or some others might not even have social media altogether. So, what's been your observation when it comes to social media and cricketers?
Josh Hazlewood's one prominent guy who doesn't have any social media, to the best of my knowledge. He's a pretty low key guy, and I think he finds it best to stay off it. Look, it's a bit of not to repeat myself, but it's like everything. There's a spectrum of reasons guys use it, and girls for that matter. I think a lot of it is commercial. I think there's the ability to cultivate a brand, plug various products or affiliations or causes, because of the platforms they have is a big part of it. You look at Pat Cummins, and there's a lot of commercial stuff on his social media. It's not the only one. A lot of these guys, Alex Carey, David Warner, Steve Smith, Nathan Light, like that. I could, if I list them all, I'll miss someone, and it will be unintentional. But I think to a large degree, it is done for commercial purposes, and brand cultivation. There's also an element there. I'm sure there's an element of connectedness with fans, with other people. Obviously, there are other. Being on social media is not the only way to connect with people, but there's a lot of different ways to use social media. I think a lot of them. Look, I think there are some that. I think a lot of them are advised not to read the comments, but I think human nature is that inevitably a lot of them do. I think Travis Head's on record as saying that he sees everything and he seeks stuff out, and often it will end up spurring them, particularly when it comes from former players. I think that's where Adam Zampa's been, speaking about keeping the receipts and the like. So that's certainly been a phenomenon within this Australian team. There is an element of keeping others in check if they do hear things. They're not necessarily from social media comments, but they're from say something that's said on radio or on TV or another forum that seep through. I've had players, not that often, but certainly I've had instances where players or people near players have sort of have taken issue with something I've written about them. Generally, it's their criticism is there's a range. Sometimes the criticism is fair. Sometimes the criticism I think is unfounded. But they're also from a position of if there's something, if there's criticism of you, I mean, it's human nature to be not necessarily take that well. There's a range. I think players would be best advised, if possible, to try to not to get sucked into it too much, because I think if you're always reading the comments, you will find people who will say stuff that you won't like, and you'll find plenty of people who say stuff you will like too. And I think like in any, at a much lower level as a notionally public figure myself, I get a degree of feedback, on social media about my work, and I read some of it. Some of it's very stinging, some of it's quite complimentary, but you're ultimately like, if you put yourself out there in any sort of semi-public endeavour, and as I said, what I would cop would be an absolute fraction of what a professional cricketer would cop. You open yourself up to it, so you're probably better off narrowing your gaze and, like anything, listening to a few people who's a handful of people whose judgment you really value and trust to be the sort of the arbiters of what you think your behaviour and your work, and the quality of it.
I know we've kept you on, and I'll ask a few questions before we wrap up the show, since we're nearing the end of the show. I wanted to ask about team culture and the evolution over the past few years, or maybe the past decade or so, from I think when it comes to when the Australian team had the likes of Ricky Ponting and Andrew Simons and Matthew Hayden, it came across as a very tough environment where you had to really work and work hard. I mean, not to say that the players aren't working hard now, but it seems like right now there's a push towards a more easygoing environment, kind of do at your own time, work hard, but not necessarily in a way that is forced upon you or regimented. There's a bit more flexibility. People talk about the way that England train a bit more relaxed. I think Australia may not copy the exact model that England are doing, but they have their own version of it where there's a bit of flexibility and easygoing environment. So do you think from your end, like you've observed, even when it comes to not just international cricket, but Sheffield Shield teams, for example, is there a generally shift towards a more easygoing, laid-back environment compared to maybe a decade ago, where it's a lot more rough and tough and dog-eat-dog world maybe at some moments? And do you think that has been a positive change, or maybe is it a negative thing potentially?
I think definitely we're in a less prescriptive era of coaching. Probably there's an element where player power has been a big part of that. And I think ultimately, look, the Justin Langer era and the end of his time as Australian coach was clearly a key part of this, and the way that panned out, and how messy that was, and clearly several players in that team had just had enough of Justin's supposed volatility and the way he was coaching them, but and probably quite a prescriptive nature. But you also got to remember why he was brought in and the circumstances in which he was brought in, on the back of ball tampering, and to try to really straighten things up. And I think to a significant degree he did that. That's one. That's probably the micro example. In terms of the broader macro, I think you've got a greater power and player empowerment, player entitlement. I mean, I think the fact that the players now have options the top players around the world. So, um, if Travis Head isn't enjoying his experience with the Australian team, he can go and make a lot of money not playing for Australia. So, if I'm Andrew McDonald on the Australian coaching staff, I'm massively, obviously, I'm incentivized to try to win and try to create an environment where we think we can win, but also significantly incentivized to create a part of that is to try to ensure that there is an environment where the players actually want to be. So these players work in different ways. I still think they do spend a lot. I mean, they do spend still a hell of a lot of time working on their craft. You still see guys spending hours and hours in the nets, particularly the likes of the cliche, but here's the likes of Marnus. Steve Smith, probably not quite as much as he used to. Somewhat Jake Weatherald is a very hard trainer. I see him spend a lot of time in the nets from what I've seen of him. Within state cricket, there are guys that do more or less as well. I think the challenge, say, for an Australian men's team perspective, is that it's an older side, and I think when you have older, experienced players who know their games, know what it takes for them to get their best out of their games, you can place more trust and probably create greater allowances. And it goes back to even what I said about Steve Smith at the start of this earlier in the chat about him not playing as much Shield cricket. But if you've got a younger generation of players coming through, like Sam Constas, not to say that Sam, I think he's very, very hardworking, but you probably need to be a bit more prescriptive. And then that sort of creates a thing, was it rules for some, rules for others? Well, it probably is to a degree. And there's that challenge of trying to create norms and standards that can filter down through the levels, but without alienating people at the top who, may be burnt out or may not be best suited by that sort of same level of prescription. It's a very interesting area, one to watch. I think with Australia, though, like you say, compare it to England, I think ultimately Australia, while there are probably some elements that are a lot more relaxed than, say, previous iterations of the Australian team, I think there is still I do still seem to train pretty cleverly, and there's a level of smarts to that operation, which certainly parts of their operation are still very good. Do cross every T and dot every I. Whereas I think in England's case, I mean, it would appear that was just not the case during the Ashes, and probably hasn't been the case at times during the McCullum regime, and that there are elements there which are a bit more laissez-faire. So that's probably the contrast. But again, that's only an outside view. And yes, you watch them, but having said that, if you watch England train, you watch Australia train, you wouldn't notice necessarily any huge differences. I mean, at the end of the day, most cricket training sessions are pretty similar. It's a bit of fielding, and then they go to the nets. Like it's like that at any level. There's not that much different.
I'll ask two quick questions. I appreciate all the insights throughout the show. It's been really engaging, and maybe for another time we can even do a longer podcast, because there's so much we can keep talking about, so much to talk about when it comes to Australian cricket specifically. But I know that you mentioned earlier on the podcast you have had the opportunity to cover many different games all around the world. So what's been your most memorable sports journalism experience when it comes to going somewhere and watching a certain game or covering a certain game? And also on top of that, which player do you feel that probably should have got an opportunity for Australia, or maybe hasn't had as many opportunities for Australia, but is definitely, you've seen, is has all the tools to be a great international player, but probably didn't get things, the stars didn't line up for them, unfortunately?
I think in the first instance, look, I mean, very lucky. I've seen a lot of great things. Because it is a cricket show, probably I'll give a couple both from 2023, being there for the Edgbaston Test and the finish of that, when Pat Cummins and Nathan Lyon put on, 40 for the second last wicket, the ninth wicket, to win deep on day 5. To see Australia win a thrilling Ashes Test like that was fantastic. And then also to be there for the World Cup final and Australia's win and then Travis Head's innings, and just to be at the Modi Stadium and the cacophony of Indian fans being silenced was extraordinary, and both iconic Australian victories, and I think when they're on the road, there's always that extra element of achievement. In terms of Australian players. Look, through that era, 15 to 25 years ago, there was so many that were unlucky. I'd probably say the one guy that I think his numbers suggest he was incredibly stiff not to play a test match, at least one, was David Hussey. I think he averaged 54 thereabouts in first class cricket, maybe slightly less, but thereabouts. A lot of that was county runs, but also very good Sheffield Shield record. Did okay for Australia in one day cricket without dominating, but and T20 cricket. But yeah, he's probably one guy that I think was very, very unlucky not to play at least one test.
Appreciate all the thoughts, all the insights you've really given, I guess, the listeners an insight into, firstly, obviously, what you cover, but also on top of that, like through your observations, understanding um, more about what the players have to go through and, that kind of side of the game where probably doesn't get covered because you guys are usually, as journalists, are covering the game in of itself, but then to get, more behind the scenes, what's happening and those dynamics with media, social media, has been really, really, really engaging in that sense. So I don't know if you had any final thoughts before we wrap up the show.
No, no, no. Thank you, Tanzim. No, that was. I appreciate all the questions, and no, happy to come on. Hopefully, I've provided a few insights for your watchers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Dane. We'll wrap it up there. So, for all the listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to reach us out on social media. We're on Instagram or on TikTok. We can also view us on Spotify or on YouTube, Apple iTunes as well. So, give us, subscribe to us there and give us a like and follow our content and share our content with your friends and family. So, from our special guest, Daniel Cherny, wish you the best. This is Sandom signing off. Thank you very much.